Hello everyone, and as always, welcome to the YouTube video. I've been wanting to make this video for a while now because I'm both curious what you all think, and also I wanted to express some of my thoughts regarding some of the things that are going on in the world of D&D right now, or more so some of the really big changes that are happening with the system. So I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions perhaps on some of these changes, and obviously I wanted to express some of my own and see if you guys happen to share any of them or anything else like that. But without further ado, let's get right into the meat of things. But before I begin, let me say something. I love D&D. I've been playing the game for the better part of a decade at this point, and I play the game roughly 2 to 3 times a week, and I don't plan to stop anytime soon. The game is very special to me, and I truly love it, and that's the reason why I'm making this video, because I'm worried about the direction that the game is taking, and I want to express some of my thoughts and opinions on the future of the game. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this D&D Forever mentality that WotC has recently been talking about in some of their videos that they've released. So for those of you who are a little confused what I mean, Wizards of the Coast has officially announced that they are no longer going to be referring to new editions of the game as editions, but instead are just going to be referring to them by their release year, and they're just all going to be underneath the massive umbrella that is D&D 5th edition.
We are no longer in the position where we think of D&D as an edition. It's just D&D.
As we've been working on new versions. And so to make it clear for ourselves which version that we're talking about, we will talk about the 2014 Player's Handbook and then talk then about what we might be doing the same or differently in the 2024 Player's Handbook.
Okay, so from a fan of the game's perspective, I really don't like this. It doesn't roll off a tongue, it doesn't make sense that we've been referring to versions of the game as editions this entire time, and now we're just switching to referring them by the year that they're released, like some sort of a car or something like that. And on top of that, I don't buy that the design team behind closed doors have been referring to this as the 2024 version when we know that they've been trying to call it one D&D this entire time. If anything, I think that Hasbro forced them to start calling it the 2024 version after 1D&D had its name absolutely destroyed in the past couple of months. If a player buys a new version of the D&D Player's Handbook and they show up at the table ready to play, right? But then they find out that the GM or perhaps the other players are using the 2024 version of the Player's Handbook rather than the 2014 handbook, then how are they supposed to know? Because from the player's perspective, they were showing up and they were playing D&D 5th edition. Not D&D 5th edition 2024 version or whatever, like, you know what I mean? I mean, that's the purpose of there being editions, right? It's so that way they were easily distinguishable from each other, and GMs and players alike can easily reference them instead of having to clarify the year of release. I just really don't like this change, but I can see why they're making it. But here's something that I find really annoying about this change. So normally when there is a new edition that is announced or released, the entire community is buzzing with excitement regarding the new changes and things that are going to be in the new edition. Normally they're excited about new classes, new abilities, new features, adjustments to wording or balancing and so forth, because a new edition means that all of those get changed in bulk. Because it's a new edition, right? So the vast majority of things in the system get changed, or altered at least in some way. And for me personally, I was really excited for a new version of D&D because it meant that WotC has the chance to completely overhaul and completely change some of the glaring issues that 5th edition has, being its issues with character creation, monster balancing, its vaguety with descriptions of rules, features, and spells, and so forth. And don't get me wrong, I know that they are going to be overhauling a large amount, if not all of the classes that 5th edition has and so forth, but some of the issues aren't only tied to that. Some of them are also the monsters, and other issues are their description of things. And they've mentioned multiple times in some of their announcements on Twitter or some of their YouTube videos that they've recently released that they will be making these new books completely compatible with all of the books that have come forth previously. Specifically mentioning that if you run Curse of Strahd, for example, it's perfectly compatible with these new books. So if that is to be believed, then that means all the monsters in Curse of Strahd and so forth will stay the same. Meaning that if these new classes and features will be just vastly stronger, that means that the GMs themselves will have to go into Curse of Strahd, for example, and have to either buff those monsters themselves or wait for WotC to come out with a patch note to fix that, if that makes sense. One other thing I'm really worried about for this new version of D&D, I guess, is the balancing of it. Because with the current version of D&D, there is a meta, I guess, for building a character. There is an optimal way to build your character and to get the most damage out of it and the most usefulness out of features and so forth by building them in a certain way, right? And this can lead to obviously players in the current version of D&D feeling inadequate or perhaps like they're playing the game wrong when they're not doing as much damage or not being quite as useful as the other players in the game when they see another player using a meta build for their character that's doing way more damage than the other player is and so forth. And I don't really like that. And this can obviously lead to the GM having to implement tons of house rules to try to balance encounters and prevent meta builds from completely taking over encounters by demolishing the competition, including the other characters and players at the table. And this can obviously lead to more issues down the road, because then if the GM just lets everything play out as written and doesn't tinker with any of the rules or implement house rules to try to balance situations themselves, then sometimes these meta builds can just take situations and absolutely demolish them. And then the GM has to throw more monsters or more challenging encounters at the party to try to balance this. But then if that meta character goes down, then that could mean a potential TPK for the entire party. And don't even get me started on trying to balance mid to high level encounters when you have a character, or a player I should say, who's playing a very meta character build. But then, of course, if the GM does implement house rules to try to balance out a character, or perhaps tries to throw monsters that are the weakness for a particular character build at the party, then the meta character, or the player playing the meta character I should say, feels targeted because you're trying to specifically go after them to balance encounters. And that's also not fun. And maybe you're the type of player where you don't really care about that kind of stuff and you're more there for the role-playing aspect of the game and not so much the combat encounters, and that's perfectly fine. But the vast majority of players are there for both, or perhaps more so the combat rather than the role-playing aspect. And if that's the case, and they come across a player who's playing a meta character, this can really take away from the experience for them. Because in a D&D session, your characters are the heroes, they're the focus of the story. And in combat, if the spotlight is always on one of the player characters because they're always getting the last hit or always doing the most damage, not because of skill or strategy, but because they're playing a Bugbear Rune Knight who has an extra 5 feet of reach for some reason, and who has the Polearm Master and Alert feats, which isn't really a big deal, but combined with this stupid ability, which doesn't mention anything about limitations on how many times it can be used per turn, and does the same damage as a Greatsword, combined with Polearm Master or Great Weapon Master, it just makes the build absolutely busted and makes other characters feel inadequate when a Bugbear character is dealing an extra 2d6 damage just for free for playing that race. And don't get me wrong, I know that this can easily be solved with a quick subclass or racial ban in the character creation process, or you can just implement some house rules to try to balance this out. But if you're an inexperienced GM, you may not even know this exists. Meanwhile, a player can easily just look up broken D&D 5e builds and then find this, and then easily bring it to the table. And then if you're an inexperienced GM, again, you may not want to just obviously smite a character if they show up to the game and start playing with it. Or perhaps just try to completely balance it by removing abilities entirely. And then obviously that means that the player then thinks, oh, well, I don't want to play this character anymore because it's no longer broken, or it's no longer what I wanted to play. And if you're a GM, you don't really want to do that because they're your players, and you obviously want to make sure they're having a good time. This is all to say that with D&D 5e, I don't always remember there being a meta for building a character. And I'm not really sure when this started happening, but I feel like in recent years, all of the new subclasses or classes or races or features or spells or abilities that have come out are just plain better than the core ones, which is obviously a great example of power creep. And because of this, there's no real incentive as a player to play any of the core classes or use any of those core races because the new ones that are coming out are just better. And again, I know that as a GM, you can easily solve this issue by implementing some quick restrictions with your character creation process or implementing some house rules. But if you're a new player showing up to the game and you see all of these new classes and features, and then you compare them to the old ones, why would you as a player want to use the old ones that mechanically are just worse than the newer ones? But that begs the question, why does the game even have these issues in the first place that require the GM to then know about these issues and then implement their own rules to try to solve them? Because obviously, if you're buying the game, you expect it to be play tested and fair. You just shouldn't have to play test and fix the game yourself after you've bought it, you know what I mean? Or at least in my humble opinion. In some cases, it honestly feels like WotC just came up with an idea for a subclass or race, but couldn't come up with any unique features that would incentivize players to use them. So they just threw in some abilities they thought were cool, but didn't put any time into thinking about how it interacts with the rest of the game in terms of mechanics and rules. And because of this, they published races and classes that make things feel broken, or at the very least unbalanced. And I guess we'll see if this theme continues, because in August, Wizards of the Coast is going to be releasing their new book, Glory of the Giants, which is going to be including a bunch of new subclasses for your characters to choose from, and one of which they showcased, which is the Path of the Giant subclass for the Barbarian, and particularly, this one seems a bit interesting, and I'll just let the clip speak for itself.
What excites me a little bit is the potential to get environmental kills. As its current state is right now, like, there's nothing that is more satisfying to me in D&D than getting an environmental kill. It feels like I cheated.
And here I assume you're referring to like picking up your enemy,
Yeah.
and if they fail their save,
Yeah.
tossing them into a pit
Yeah, you can
over
throw-
the cliff. Yep.
Into a wall of fire.
Or straight up into the air,
Yeah.
and then they fall. So this subclass definitely is going to need playtest feedback like everything. And I would say this whole Unearthed Arcana is a smidge more Gonzo than UA typically is.
Oh boy. I feel like I just watched a new champion release for like League of Legends or something, and I already know that the new champion's going to ruin the balancing of the game. I was really excited to play the new edition of D&D because it meant that Wizards of the Coast had a chance to start fresh. But because this new edition of D&D is no longer going to be a new edition, but is just going to be D&D 5th edition, the 2024 version, it doesn't feel like a new edition or a new release, but instead a patch note. And don't get me wrong, I know that they're going to be changing a bunch of stuff about the classes, subclasses, and features and other things like that in this new version of D&D. But it doesn't change my points that I made previously, that just because they change these things, all of these other books are supposed to be still compatible with this new version of D&D, meaning that the things that are still broken are going to remain broken or perhaps become even more broken with some of the new features or abilities that are implemented in this new edition, or excuse me, version of D&D. And this leads me to my next topic, which is that D&D is changing. Maybe you guys feel like this as well, and if you do, then feel free to leave a comment down below with your thoughts. But I feel like D&D is moving away from being a TTRPG, a tabletop role-playing game, and more towards an MMORPG. They're shifting the brand focus to be almost entirely digital. Physical books will basically now be considered collector's items. They're shoveling money into their new VTT, and they're removing additions to homogenize the entire system so that way it's more friendly to the video game format. I don't know about you guys, but it feels like they're literally just making D&D become one version so that they can just release patch notes on the VTT and then make them official changes to the digital books. And, well, if you want the new rules, but you bought a physical copy and don't play online, well then, sorry buddy, go buy a new book, you know what I mean? This just feels like WotC and to a greater extent Hasbro are trying to turn D&D into something that it's not, which is a easily monetizable VTT or video game in the sense that's going to be a live service that is going to have adventure season passes or downloadable content or accessories that you can purchase for spell effects or your character or so forth. And that's not what D&D is about. D&D is a TTRPG that is only limited by your imagination as the GM and the players. That's the reason why people like it. That's the reason why people play it. Because they want to have that sense of imagination and immersion that obviously can be enhanced by a VTT, but not limited by, obviously, the paywalls of, sorry, you don't have that membership, so you don't get access to that adventure, or so forth. And obviously, we know why they're doing this. Hasbro wants to increase their profits, and D&D is one of their cash cows. And they're not the only victim in this case, because obviously, Hasbro has utilized their other cash cows to try to squeeze as much money as possible out of us pesky customers. Since I'm a game master that specializes with introducing new people to D&D and Pathfinder, I decided to ask some of my D&D players who I'm introducing to the game regarding this situation and what they thought about it. And the vast majority of them didn't know that these changes were even happening, and they didn't really care as long as they got to play the game. And if they were aware, they felt like WotC was just trying to make D&D an online video game by making it as easily accessible and monetizable as possible. And I tend to agree. Obviously, the most difficult part about the game is trying to, obviously, get your friends together and play it, and of course try to find a GM. And one of the goals of the VTT that D&D is currently trying to release is making being a GM as easy as possible by maybe providing you certain tools or buttons to click that will automatically do certain things or so forth. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I feel like eventually they will just remove the GM altogether from the equation, thus making it just a video game. Even in D&D's most recent video, they reiterated over and over again that they want the community to feel included in the process of making D&D.
All again, checking in with the community as we go to see what are you liking, what would you rather us leave behind, what do you love, what do you want us to protect and carry forward.
But these words feel hollow. If they want us to feel included, then why don't they listen to us? If they want our feedback, then why don't they listen to it? It's not necessarily a bad thing, but D&D is changing. That much is evident to anyone who is closely following the game. And because of these upcoming changes, myself, along with many others, are afraid that the game will no longer be the same system that has become a massive part of our lives. There has already been a massive shift in the tabletop RPG community. More people are switching from D&D and are trying out new systems, some have abandoned D&D altogether and are making their own version of it, and some are just sticking with it and hoping that WotC will do them justice and continue making the game that they enjoy playing, just in a virtual format. And don't forget, the best part about D&D is that the game is whatever you want to make it to be. You don't have to use these new rules if you don't want to. Heck, you don't even have to use the current ones if you don't want to. You can just play the game however you would like to, and the game rules are there for you to completely mold and adjust however you would like. But I myself fear that in the coming years, D&D will no longer be the TTRPG brand that many of us have come to know and love, but will instead become a video game that attempts to bottleneck creativity for the sake of monetization. But with that, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you guys continue to play D&D currently? Have you moved on to a new system? Are you concerned or not concerned with the new upcoming changes? Or perhaps you're excited for the new VTT and are excited to try it out? Please let me know in the comments down below. But with that, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy. Bye-bye.